Hey guys, welcome back. So let's talk about Dare the Impossible. Sounds like a movie title, a movie title, right? But I think if you're really honest with yourself and if you're in touch with your inner being, there's a little voice of excitement. There's something that that kind of like wakes up when you hear that title because I think it speaks to something important that is embedded within us, right? But um, even the title itself sounds strange. Dare the impossible. I mean, why would you want to dare something that is impossible? I mean, isn't the fact that it is impossible supposed to be the period, the full stop? Why dare it? Why do something that is not possible? But you know, that title, I think that phrase really holds the key for unlocking or to unlocking a richer life. But even before we sort of break that down, I'd like to share this quote that I came about recently that I think is really apt to this conversation and goes like this: There are no constraints to human mind, no walls around the human spirit, no barriers to our progress except those we ourselves erect. There are no constraints on the human mind, no walls around the human spirit, no barriers to our progress except those we ourselves erect. Those words were uttered by possibly one of the greatest leaders of the 20th century, and that was Ronald Reagan. For those of you who know Ronald Reagan, he was one of the presidents of the United States, the 40th president, I believe, of the United States, and that quote is attributed to him. Now, why is that so important? Why should we dare the impossible? Why should we dare something that is impossible? So if you look at the dictionary, or if you do a Google search or something, when you want to define impossible, it's basically around three things. Something that you're not able to conceive, something you're not able to do, something that can't occur or that can't exist. In other words, when people say that this cannot exist, this cannot happen, this cannot be done, they are saying that something is impossible. But I'm here, but this title of this episode is saying dare the impossible. So what does it mean? It means that perhaps, just perhaps, impossibility is not the end of the game. It means perhaps that there is something stronger than what you think is impossible. And what is that? I think that is the human spirit. Now, it's interesting to know that all through history, whenever things have been said to be impossible, in any generation and in every generation, there is always someone or some people that would rise up and destroy that, right? Whatever was deemed to be impossible, someone or some people would rise up and do that thing. And these examples are found throughout history, right? So, for example, I remember reading that in 1842, there was a French scientist called Auguste Comte. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. I don't know French that well. But he wrote in I think one of his studies or one of his theses that it is impossible, right, to know anything about stars and about planets, right? It's virtually impossible that we cannot know anything more about them other than what we currently know. And that was in 1842, right? And at that time, the knowledge of things like the solar systems, the stars, and the planets was very limited. So, what this guy was saying essentially that what they knew was all there was to know, that they couldn't know anything any further, that human beings could never know anything beyond what was already known, as little as it was. 2042. In other words, it was impossible. But guess what? Haven't we learned so much more of the solar system? Haven't we learned so much more about the composition of the stars and the planets? Aren't we on the verge of going to another planet? This was something that was supposed to be impossible. In 1895, here's another one. Even though there was some semblance of aircraft, right, going on, that this was the late 19th century. The supposition or the general assumption was that any craft or anything that was going to fly in the air, right, could not be heavier than the air. That it was impossible to have a heavier than air flight or a heavier than air contraption that would take man in the air that would enable him fly. It was impossible. This was 1895. But guess what? Guess what? Just 8 years later, two brothers, Wilbur and Orville Wright, developed a plane, right, which was heavier than the air. 8 years down the line, this was something that was supposed to be impossible. And another one, this is one of my more favorite stories. In 1964, February 1964, the world heavyweight champion of the world, boxing champion of the world, was one of the most feared guys on the planet. This guy was so terrifying. He was so huge. He was so muscular. He was somebody who did away with opponents one after the other like clockwork. He had this terrifying, huge wrecking ball of a right hand that could just lay out an opponent flat. His name was Sonny Liston. And guess what? It was impossible for anybody to beat Sonny. Impossible. But suddenly, from nowhere, or seemingly from nowhere, emerged this young 22-year-old guy who claimed that he could beat Sonny Liston. This was a guy, young guy, good-looking kid, who claimed that he could beat Sonny Liston. And not only that, he proclaimed himself as the greatest. I'm sure you know who that is. At that time, his name was Cassius Clay, but the name that everybody remembers him as is Muhammad Ali. So what are we saying? For every time something or anything has been said to be impossible, somebody or some people have always come to show that that was not the case. In other words, impossibility is not something that the human spirit is supposed to be under, right? The true essence of our spirit is that nothing is impossible. This is why we feel such an affinity for anybody who does what is termed as impossible. We love champions. We love stories that are able to conquer the unthinkable. People who have survived enormous odds. People who have done great things that are mind-boggling. Things that other people have said were impossible. Deep down, you always feel an affinity for that. You admire the person. Why? It is because your spirit, relates with that thing, because that is exactly what you're supposed to be, who you're supposed to be. Impossibility is not a word that should own you or that should define you. If anything, it is something that you're supposed to leverage, or that is supposed to propel you. So when we say dare the impossible, it means that forget about what has been defined as impossibility. Impossibility, in my mind, is a fact. And what's the difference? What is a fact? A fact is something that is based on current reality. Current reality, right? For instance, if I held a seed in my hand and I asked you what it was, you would say, duh, it's a seed, right? Yeah, it's a seed. Because that's a scientific fact. It's an inarguable fact. What I'm holding is actually a seed. But if I took that seed and planted it in fertile ground, what happens? It doesn't stay a seed anymore, does it? No. It goes through a process and develops into a tree. And in that tree, if it's a fruit bearing tree, are seeds or are fruits that have seeds in them, which have the potential to produce a multiplicity of trees. In other words, from one seed, you can have a forest. So the fact is, what I'm holding is a seed. But the truth is that what I'm holding isn't actually a forest. Impossibility, daring the impossible, has to do with recognizing what is fact and what is truth. Truth always transcends current realities and reaches down into the true potential, which is exactly what's supposed to be happening to you. Your spirit has limitless potential for the thing that you were created to do and to be. And once you tap into that, no matter how dire the circumstances seem, how dark the situation is, how impossible what your vision or your purpose is, so far it is truly your vision and your purpose, truly, then your potential will knock all that out of the way. Dare the impossible. Dare the impossible.